So number one, thank you guys for bringing me 200 subscribers. I was not expecting it to happen. The growth has been very slow and mostly based on a couple videos. So I'm, first off, just really happy about it. So for celebration, here is a video that I have put off doing for a very long time because it is long and I didn't want to edit it. Steven Universe and mental health. So obviously, Steven Universe Future, the main theme of it was mental health and basically PTSD of its main character. Steven Universe tried to cover a lot of different themes and by doing so left more than a few underdeveloped. While in earlier seasons it was often a background theme that was overshadowed by the gratuitous filler and overarching "do we inherit the sins of our parents" arc, mental illness was the main theme of Steven Universe Future. Unlike previous seasons, Steven Universe Future decided to take a different route from the traditional man versus man conflict. Instead of the traditional external villain, Steven Universe Future made Steven his own enemy, as he dealt with an unnamed mental illness which arose after he was finally given the time to deal with his previous traumas. As a psych major, I do have a decent amount of knowledge on mental illness, and it made me really upset to see how the show ended on a poorly handled note. Having mental illness portrayed in a kids' show was bad. Not because it's inherently bad for kids' shows to have darker themes or more mature messages, but because it's a very delicate and nuanced subject, and it's very hard to portray accurately. There are 3 examples of mental illness that are the most prevalent to the show as a whole: Steven, Lapis, and Pearl. These 3 characters have the most pronounced and impactful examples of mental illness in Steven Universe, and are often touted as great examples even though they are very much not. Let's start with Pearl. Starting back in Season 1, it's obvious that Pearl has an unhealthy attachment to Rose. It's not immediately obvious that it's unhealthy, as her relationship with Rose is primarily defined by her grief. However, I think that Pearl shows symptoms of borderline personality disorder. As defined by the DSM-5, a person must have at least 5 symptoms in order to be diagnosed. Of the symptoms listed, Pearl fulfills the following: a pattern of intense and unstable interpersonal relationships characterized by alienating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. It's only in Sworn to the Sword that the exact nature of Pearl and Rose's relationship becomes apparent. Steven suggests that Pearl should train Connie how to sword fight, but she only agrees to do so when Connie says, "I don't know what'll happen in the future, but if it's something dangerous comes along, I don't want to be a burden. I want to help. I want to be there for Steven to fight by his side. The Earth is my home too. Can't I help protect it?" Later in the episode, Pearl projects her own relationship with Rose onto Connie and her relationship with Steven. When they arrive at the Sky Arena, Pearl introduces the scene by saying, "It was here that I became familiar with the human concept of being a knight, completely dedicated to a person and a cause. This is what you must become: a brave, selfless, loyal, a knight." We begin with a bow, first to me, your teacher, and even from this early on, it's pretty obvious that Pearl places a very high importance on self-sacrifice and on having an attachment to a specific person. She tries to impress upon Connie that the best way to find self-worth is through devotion to someone else. We are also shown in this episode that Pearl exhibited recklessness that could be construed as suicidal or self-harming tendencies. Later on, we learn that Rose is actually Pink Diamond, and that Pink Diamond was Pearl's original owner, meaning that Pearl, a slave, fell in love with her master. Now, this does not technically directly relate with a mental illness. I do think it counts as a trauma that obviously affected her. Her relationship with Pink Diamond casts her in an extremely idealized light, and she sees her as having done no wrong and continues to uphold the image of her, despite her death and immoral behaviors. It's not until later in the series, post the reveal to Steven of what Rose made her do, that she begins to see her in a lesser light. However, it is a near constant from Season 1 all the way through Steven Universe Future that Pearl holds, or held at some point, Rose to be extremely idealized while devaluing herself in her service. Number 2. Identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. Pearl's feelings of self-worth, better summarizes her self-confidence, change throughout the series, and it is one of her most defining arcs. Starting in episode 3, we see that she views herself as lesser than Rose, and later Steven, as she tried to give her life for Rose on multiple occasions and tried to get Connie to adopt the same mindset for Steven. This stems from her background as a maid-to-order servant for the upper class who was created to view herself as nothing more than a servant meant for standing around and holding stuff. Because of this, she feels subordinate to others, particularly to Rose, even after she no longer identifies as Pink Diamond. Her self-image shifts throughout the series, rounding out with Last One Out of Beach City, where she decides she is over Rose and pursues a different woman who still looks a lot like Rose. as well as a single pale rose where she finally reveals to Steven the extent of her trauma, as well as her final actions with him. During the movie, this arc is done once again as she loses her memories and imprints on Greg. She shifts between feeling like an object and being an independent Pearl. Number 3, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, and self-mutilating behavior. This is evident during her time during the war when she acted recklessly to protect Rose. It's referenced primarily through Sworn to the Sword when it's mentioned that she was poofed thousands of times for Rose's sake. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Unlike Amethyst, she doesn't intentionally poof herself multiple times, but in the past had reckless behavior, which is pretty comparable to acting with a suicidal intent. Of course, it's not an exact parallel due to the nature of Gem life not really being alive, but it's close enough for us to count it. Number 4, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. When Pearl was confronted with Greg stealing Rose away with her, she acted out on a few occasions. When she fused with Rose in front of him as a way of intimidation, she illustrated a need to assert her claim on Rose. Later on, during Coach Steven, she rushes to prove that she is strong in the real way to affirm her status with Steven. Because the gems have been around for such a long period of time, it's safe to say that each instance of disordered behavior has been repeated countless times off-screen, so we can mark this down as a repeated symptom. And number 5, affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. Whenever Rose is mentioned, Pearl shifts between protective, angered, grieving, and enamored. When she finds out that Rose had a secret lion, she gets defensive and angry that there were aspects to Rose that she didn't know about. When she finds about Rose's scabbard, she has a freak out which culminates in her running from Steven as he tries to determine what happened, and doesn't even bother to see if Steven made the jump between the final 2 rocks. These are just a couple examples out of a handful that illustrate the range of emotions that she feels whenever Rose is brought into the equation. It mostly stays on one end of the spectrum, but she is markedly reactive to Rose's presence. Now, I admit freely that much of this is up to interpretation of the source material, and that as I do not yet have a degree, I am not actually licensed to diagnose. However, based on the requirements for the DSM-5, I believe that Pearl could be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, or at least shows many symptoms of it. Now, my main problem with how Pearl is portrayed is not that she was never given a named disorder. You don't have to name a disorder for it to be portrayed well, and in the story itself, it wasn't necessary for it to be named to be effective. However, what I do have a problem with is how it was dealt with in story. At the end of the day, Pearl gets over Rose and has better self-esteem. For a kid's show, I'm fine with the way it was shown and resolved. Children aren't going to be interested in watching Pearl go to therapy, but the show illustrates a series of events that more or less mimics the general arc therapy hopes to accomplish, and begets the same goals. Out of the 3 examples I'm discussing today, I think that Pearl was one of the best examples of mental health done in the show, although it really could have been done with more nuance, and perhaps with a bit more clarity on what exactly they were aiming for. Next up is Lapis. Her character, just like the rest of the series, is biased, as it's shown from Steven's point of view. From the start, she's portrayed as a victim, because she's nice to Steven, and Steven wants to help her. Her backstory of being trapped in the mirror, and then deciding to steal the ocean to try and get home, could have easily been villainous sympathy for an understandable but still immoral action. However, we are taught from the start that she is a friend. She seems to have some hang-ups about her years being trapped, but it's not until Lapis fuses with Jasper that her character becomes truly muddled. Lapis accepts Jasper's plea to fuse. For better or worse, she gives consent to fuse with the intent of using that against her. If we are to view fusing as either rape or an abusive relationship in this instance, either of which could apply given the fusion's fluidity, Lapis starts it. Jasper is completely upfront with what she asks for and what she intends to get from the fusion, while Lapis lies. She then proceeds to trap Jasper and keep her under the ocean for a very long time. Later, Lapis and Steven go to the ocean on a boat, and Lapis admits that she liked taking it out on Jasper. She liked hurting her. So with this information, Lapis should have been shifted into the role of villain, or at least seen with a more critical eye. However, she is still portrayed all throughout the series as a victim of abuse, rather than a survivor turned abuser. After all, there is no proof that Lapis has PTSD from the fusion. The best we could ascribe to her is depression due to her antipathy, but even that is a weak connection as she doesn't really provide enough symptoms to receive that diagnosis. To be quite honest, it seems like her mental illness stems from the thousands of years held captive, not from the relationship itself. Lapis frequently lashes out, destroying Peridot's prized tape recorder, as well as illustrates manipulative behavior, such as giving Peridot an ultimatum to leave Earth with her, and when she refuses, taking their shared house away from her. Her sardonic responses and muted enthusiasm don't provide a consistent picture of a troubled victim, but rather of an abuser that no one has bothered to confront. Therein lies my problem with Lapis. She's portrayed, with no nuance and no consequences, as a good person who does bad things. It doesn't affect her relationships with others, as she's always eventually forgiven, and the world itself does little to show that her behavior is really, really wrong. By using her trauma as an excuse for bad behavior, Steven Universe follows a common trend of using mental illness to excuse it. Depression does not excuse you from being an asshole, especially if you're not asking for help from others or trying to change. The message that it's perfectly fine is a harmful one, as it makes it seem like being a bad person is okay if you have enough trauma or mental illness to be a good reason. And then we have Steven. Steven is one of the best and worst parts of the show. By changing the narrative to his point of view, it's effectively impossible to show growth beyond what he can view. It makes it impossible to know how characters react and who they are beyond what he can see. And that is part of what makes his mental illness and Steven Universe future so aggravating. If given an outside perspective, it would be at least something to corroborate that there is something going on besides vague outbursts. In addition, the way that his mental illness was dealt with, primarily by other characters ignoring the signs while his character does an entire 180, and then having off-screen therapy before running away from everyone he loves, is just not great. As it is, Steven is coded to have PTSD. I say this because his reactions seem to be tied to anger and his previous trauma. While this isn't all that makes up PTSD, it's what most people identify with it, and it's a diagnosis that most people would agree on, especially for this character. I don't mind Steven having PTSD. It's a common trope for cartoon characters wherein they do something bad or have something bad happen to them, and they have to deal with it in the future. That's fine. While I do feel there should have been some build-up in the previous seasons through bad dreams, recurrent involuntary, intrusive, and distressing memories, aka flashbacks of distress, it's fine. Steven Universe Future could have easily discarded a lot of that filler to illustrate these symptoms, but instead wasted a lot of time with unsatisfying episodes. PTSD, just like any other mental illness, requires a certain amount of requirements to be fulfilled first. Some categories require only one symptom, while others require two. He does fill the required amount in each category. He did first-hand experience exposure to actual and threatened death. Check. He did have recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic events. Check. Avoidance of the distressing memories, thoughts, feelings, or places related to the events. Check. Kinda. Persistent negative emotional state and feelings of detachment from others. Check. Irritable behavior and angry outbursts, as well as reckless or self-destructive behavior. Yes. Duration more than 1 month. Yes. It causes emotional, social, or physical distress. Check. And finally, it's not attributable to substance abuse unless he was doing crystal meth off-screen. Check. So, Steven could be diagnosed with PTSD. While it is true that these symptoms affect his social and emotional state, it does not negate his behavior towards others or override his previous bad behavior. As I've said before, Steven Universe has a habit of not holding people accountable for bad behavior. Steven is supposedly the martyr suffering from the weight of the world on his shoulders, but that would not cause a complete personality change when he becomes stupid and emotionally incompetent to the point of ignoring his own previous advice. Some other examples of this can be seen with how they treated the diamonds, like we just had to pretend that they weren't genocidal warlords through some retconning through Word of God, wherein all the planets they went to beforehand didn't have life on them, which does not make sense. Or having to deal with Jasper just suddenly being okay, like we just ignored all the things where people were bad and just didn't happen now. So what I would do to fix his portrayal of PTSD would be to give it an actual name, allowing younger audiences to have a better conception of what afflicted him besides a vague mental illness. Naming the monster is the first step to defeating it. In addition, while I still feel that having a man versus self conflict was a bad choice for a kids show, or at least this kids show, I think that showing the therapy is an important part of showing his change and growth. It's important for audiences to see cause and effect. In addition, I really don't think that all of his symptoms were aligned well with the effects of trauma, and instead reflected the producer's ideas of how trauma would reflect in Steven. So if this were to be truly fixed, I think they would need to consult a psychologist for a more accurate portrayal of war on the child's psyche. While Steven Universe was commendable for many things, mental health was one of the worst themes they took on. It was very hit and miss, with some aspects being softened by the show's emotional focus. Overall, the intent did not match the execution. Lapis was meant to be a victim, but was shown to be an abuser. Pearl was meant to have self-confidence issues, but there's a lot of underlying issues, and her relationship with Rose was fundamentally skewed. Stephen was an amalgamation of various mental health symptoms that was not treated with the respect and carefulness it deserved. With a bit of input from someone in the medical field, Steven Universe could have illustrated the dangers of mental illness as well as the empathy needed to treat them. Instead, we got a lukewarm view of what the creators think mental illness is, and such a half-assed attempt at surveying it was not even worth dealing with it at all. Misinformation is worse than ignorance. Thank you all for watching, dear viewers, but this is where we part. This was a video that has been requested from the start, and because it's so long, I hated doing the editing for it, so I apologize for taking so long to do it. Just want to say thank you again for getting me to 100 subscribers. If you have not subscribed already, please don't be afraid to like, comment, subscribe, recommend things, tell me things. I love interacting with you guys. I'll see you guys next time.